Martin Luther said Paul's letter to the church at Rome was the greatest letter ever written. The greatest letter ever written. That's the theme, or that's the title of this sermon series as we walk through the entire letter to the church at Rome. We call it the greatest letter ever written because I think Luther was right. One of the reasons I think he's right is because this is the longest letter of any of the letters in the New Testament. If you look at Paul's letters, most of them are a lot shorter. Some of them are big. The letters to the churches at Corinth, or the church at Corinth, is pretty big, but mostly it's dealing with little things that happen, and Paul's having to respond to these things that happened in the church at Corinth, and he doesn't do that as much in his letter to the church at Rome. This was written in AD 57, thereabouts. And one of the key things that we need to understand about Paul's letter to the church here is that he had never been to Rome. He had never been there in person, so he hadn't planted the church. Most all the other letters that he wrote, he actually planted that church. And so he was writing back to them to help them work through different things that were going on in the church, but he had never been to Rome, and so he devotes what we've divided into 16 chapters, communicating to them explicit things they need to know about the gospel. The greatest letter ever written. I think Martin Luther was right. And so we're going to devote the next 36 weeks to going through this entire letter. Most of the year here in 2019, as we gather for worship on Sundays, we're just devoting that to going through Paul's letter to the church at Rome, what we just call Romans. The first thing he sets out to answer is, why do we need the gospel? He sets the theme, it's the gospel of God. And then in verse 15, he's going to say, and I long to come to Rome because I want to preach the gospel to you. And then in verse 16, that famous verse, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God for salvation for all who believe. And then right from there, he transitions to helping us understand why we need it. He spends from chapter 1, verse 18, through chapter 3, verse 20, just showing you and I, putting it right in front of our face, why we need the gospel. And then in chapter 3, verse 21, he transitions and he starts answering, what is the gospel? And basically in chapter 8, verse 1, he starts with, how deep is the gospel? In chapter 3 through 7, we learn what the gospel is. And then 8, he keeps going and he says, and let me show you the depths of it. Let me show you even the heights of it. Let me show you how vast this good news is. It's not just about you. It's about everything. At the beginning of chapter 12, then after he's answered, why do we need it? What is it? How deep is it? Chapter 12 starts with, well, if all of that's true, how then should we live? How should we treat one another? What should our life look like? Everything's about the gospel. Why do we need it? What is it? How deep is it? And if the gospel's true, how should we live?